The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn as Elena Martinez pushed through the ER doors at 6:48 a.m., 15 minutes before her shift officially began. She always arrived early. Nobody noticed. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp chemical bite mixed with burnt coffee from the nurses' station, where 3-day shift nurses were already trading weekend stories in voices designed to exclude. Elena moved past them like water around a stone, her scrubs perfectly pressed, her movements economical to the point of invisibility. 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial had taught her the essential skill of being present without being seen. Her locker was in the back corner of the staff room, furthest from the chatter. She opened it with practiced quiet, hanging her jacket on the hook with the same precise care she applied to everything else. The faded unit patch sewn inside the lining caught the fluorescent light for just a moment before the jacket covered it again. Her fingers lingered there, a brief touch, barely a second, before she turned back to face the day ahead. The tremor in her left hand had started again during the drive to work, the way it always did when the morning sirens wailed across Denver's downtown grid. She pressed her palm flat against the cold metal locker until the shaking stopped. Elena had learned long ago that steady hands were non-negotiable. Hands that trembled were hands that lost patience. Hands that trembled belonged to people who hadn't learned to compartmentalize. So she breathed, a military breath, the kind they'd taught her 18 years ago in recruit training command, and she compartmentalized. The tremor faded. She was ready. The ER at Oak Creek Memorial sprawled across 12,000 square feet, arranged in a half-circle around the central nurses' station where Dr. Marcus Sterling held dominion like a man who'd been born expecting authority and never had reason to question it. Elena had worked under 7 different physicians in her tenure here. None of them had ever made her skin tight the way Dr. Sterling did. He moved through the ER with the fluid confidence of someone who understood that his position was both immutable and his due, his $12,000 watch catching the overhead lights as he reviewed patient charts on an iPad, his signature reading glasses positioned just low enough on his nose to communicate disdain. His hair was perfectly styled, salt and pepper in a way that clearly cost money to achieve. Everything about Dr. Marcus Sterling communicated that he had never once in his life felt out of place. The morning rounds began at 7. Elena was already in Bay 4, reviewing the overnight notes for a 63-year-old male admitted at 2:15 a.m. with chest pain and elevated troponin levels. The patient was sleeping now, his breathing steady, his oxygen saturation holding at 97% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Elena checked the 4-line, a 20-gauge in the left forearm, inserted with the kind of precision that came from having started approximately 4,000 of them, and made a notation in the chart with a pen that clicked exactly once. Everything she did moved in a quiet rhythm, the kind of efficiency that came from training, not habit. Dr. Sterling appeared in the bay doorway at 7:03 a.m., his presence announced first by the sound of his leather-soled shoes against the tile floor, the distinctive click-click rhythm of expensive footsteps. He didn't acknowledge Elena directly. He looked at the patient, looked at the monitors, looked at the chart, and looked through Elena as though she were a piece of medical equipment, useful, present, but beneath the threshold of actual acknowledgement. His eyes were the color of a winter sky before a storm, and they held the calculation of a man assessing whether something was worth his continued attention. "Continue the heparin drip," he said, not to Elena but to the room itself, to some invisible audience of people important enough to merit direct address. "Troponin panel in 3 hours. If the second set is elevated, we're moving to angiography." Elena nodded, a small movement of her head that registered her understanding without demanding recognition. She had learned that lesson too, the essential art of being competent without being visible. The moment you became visible to Dr. Sterling, you became either useful to his purposes or in the way of them. Elena was neither. She was the efficient machine in the corner who didn't ask questions. The morning progressed in the careful choreography of emergency medicine. Bay 2 received a 41-year-old woman with acute abdominal pain. Bay 6 held a teenager with a suspected collarbone fracture. Bay 1 was being prepped for an incoming motor vehicle accident, ETA for minutes, dispatch had said, and everyone moved with that purposeful energy that came from preparation. Elena moved between bays with the kind of precision that spoke of someone who understood human anatomy not as an academic subject but as a physical reality. Her 4 placements were clean single stick, no fishing, no digging, no apologizing. When she had to start a central line, the 78-year-old in Bay 5 with collapsed peripheral veins and no time for peripherals, her hands found the subclavian artery landmark with the kind of certainty that belonged to someone who'd done this under considerably worse circumstances than the sterile, well-lit confines of an emergency bay. The patient in Bay 5 was scared. His name was Robert, and he'd been having chest pain for 90 minutes before his wife finally convinced him to come to the hospital. Elena didn't tell him that his blood pressure was dropping or that they needed central access immediately. She didn't tell him that they were racing against a clock that only she could hear ticking in her head, the old clock from Marja, the one that marked the seconds before an 18-year-old private lost consciousness, before a young woman in navy blues had to choose between following protocol and keeping someone alive. "This will feel like pressure," Elena said, her voice steady as surgical steel, as she located the target with palpation, prepped the site, and advanced the catheter with a movement so fluid it seemed less like insertion and more like the needle simply recognizing where it needed to be. The central line seated perfectly. The flash ran clear. Robert took a shaky breath, and Elena was already annotating the placement, the time, her initials, EM, always just initials, never a full name that might attract attention. She was back at the nurse's station by 8:45 a.m., documenting the morning's work with the kind of meticulous precision that came naturally. Everything in its place. Everything correct. Everything invisible. The other nurses were gathered around the coffee machine, talking about a new physician assistant starting in the afternoon, about someone's daughter's college acceptance, about whether Dr. Sterling had mentioned the mandatory continuing education module due by Friday. Elena didn't participate. She never did. She ate her lunch at 12:15 p.m. alone in her car, parked in the back lot where the afternoon sun turned the windshield into an oven and nobody could see her pressing her forehead against the steering wheel, letting the tremor run through her hands for exactly 3 minutes before she had to go back inside. At 2:11 p.m., Dr. Sterling was reviewing patient charts again, his expensive pen moving across paper with the kind of authority that suggested he was not simply documenting, he was creating a narrative, and his narrative was the only one that mattered. Elena had just finished restocking the supply cabinet in Bay 7, had arranged the trauma shears and the alcohol wipes and the sterile gauze packs in their designated locations with the kind of orderly precision that would have made a supply sergeant weep with recognition. She didn't know he was watching until she turned and found his gaze on her, that winter sky stare taking in something, the angle of her shoulders, the way she'd organized the cabinet, the efficiency of her movements, and then dismissing it entirely. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone addressing staff rather than colleagues. "Get me the EKGs from this morning. The ones in the acute care section." Elena retrieved them without comment, without the small verbal acknowledging sounds that other nurses used. She simply placed the folder on his desk and returned to work. It wasn't insubordination. It was something more efficient than that. It was a complete absence of personality, a rendering of herself as purely functional. This was how you stayed safe. This was how you kept your head down. The afternoon shift change came at 3 p.m., and Elena briefed the incoming nurses with the kind of thorough clarity that reflected her documentation. No room for error. No room for question. Every patient accounted for, every lab ordered, every intervention documented. She moved through the handoff like a military operation, because that's what it was, really, just a different kind of operation, with different stakes, but the same fundamental requirement: precision under pressure, clarity of communication, and the absolute absence of ego. Dr. Sterling was still in the department at 3:15 p.m. when Elena was packing her things, hanging her jacket back in the locker, feeling that brief moment of relief that came with the end of a shift. She touched the unit patch inside the lining one more time, a habit now, a ritual. 3 years of this. 3 years of being invisible, being efficient, being nothing. And in those 3 years, she had saved more lives than she could count, and no one, not a single person in this hospital, had any idea that Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, who had held a field hospital alone for 14 hours under fire in Marja, was pushing a supply cart down a corridor in Denver, Colorado, pretending that the simplest anonymity was a blessing rather than a penance. The morning rounds began at 7 o'clock sharp, which meant Dr. Sterling arrived at 6:58, moving through Oak Creek Memorial's corridors like a man who owned the place. Elena had already been at her station for an hour, verifying medication counts, updating patient charts, moving through the work with the kind of invisible efficiency that comes from 3 years of deliberately taking up no space. She didn't look up when Sterling entered the nurse's station. She didn't need to. She could hear him the way soldiers hear distant artillery, not by sound alone, but by the shift in air pressure, the subtle change in how everyone around him tightened. "Morning rounds," Sterling announced, loud enough to gather the assembled staff. Residents, interns, 2 senior nurses, 3 med students. The room had that particular quality of forced casualness that precedes something deliberate. Elena continued charting. Her pen moved with mechanical precision across the patient summary. Section A, Section B, vitals documented in their neat rows. She knew what was coming. 3 years of quiet observation had taught her how to recognize the moment before a predator decides to feed. "I'm making a bet," Sterling said, positioning himself against the central desk with the posture of a man settling in for entertainment. His fingers drummed against the laminate surface. Tap. 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 "Our little mouse here won't last a week. I'm serious. Anyone want to take the other side? I'll put down $200 she walks by Friday." He turned to face the room, his smile the kind that shows teeth but never reaches the eyes. A lawyer's smile. A confidence man's smile. The smile of someone accustomed to getting his way because the world had never told him no with consequences. Laughter rippled through the station. Nervous laughter. The kind that comes from people who sense violence but are too invested in the social hierarchy to interrupt it. A med student chuckled. One of the residents smiled and looked away. The senior nurses exchanged glances but said nothing. Elena turned a page in the chart. Page 2. Section C. She took one measured breath through her nose. Her hand didn't waver. Her jaw didn't clench. She had been called worse by worse men, and the ones in this room weren't even trying. "I'm serious," Sterling continued, addressing the room as if Elena were deaf, or absent, or both. $200. Anyone? He waited. Nobody took the bet. They all knew what it meant to bet against Sterling. The payoff wasn't money, the payoff was the satisfaction of being on his side, and the cost was watching someone else burn. Elena finished documenting the last patient. She closed the chart. Stood. Moved to the next station without looking at him. Her movements were economical, purposeful. The kind of movement that comes from carrying 70 pounds of gear over mountain terrain, from sleeping in 30-second intervals, from knowing that wasted energy is wasted life. 3 days passed. 72 hours of Sterling's public campaign escalating in careful increments. A dismissive comment during grand rounds. A patient complaint that never happened, written into her permanent file with his signature. Scheduling her for the graveyard shift followed immediately by a morning meeting, sleep deprivation as a tool. Each move calculated. Each move deniable. This was stage 2 of his escalation, not pure social attack, but the weaponization of institutional power. The cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial operated on 3 cycles. Lunch rush occupied the hours between 11:48 a.m. and 1:48 p.m. The space filled with physicians in their white coats, nurses in scrubs of varying colors, custodial staff, lab technicians, administrative personnel. An entire ecosystem of hierarchy rendered visible by uniform alone. Elena sat at a table in the corner, her usual spot positioned where she could see the exits and the room simultaneously, a habit that outlived the circumstances that created it. She had a salad. 3 days old, taken from her car where she kept a small cooler. Lettuce. Carrots. Protein powder mixed into the dressing because it was calorie efficient. A cup of black coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. She reached for the coffee. Her hand was 2 inches from the handle when Sterling approached from her blind spot. Not an accident. He had timed it. He had watched her. He had waited for the specific moment when she was committed to the gesture but not yet defended. His elbow caught the edge of the tray with the kind of precision that only looks like clumsiness to people who haven't trained in violence recognition. The bowl tipped. The salad dispersed across the tile floor in a scatter of lettuce and shredded carrot, oil and vinegar spreading in dark tributaries. The coffee cup toppled. Liquid pooled across the white ceramic, soaking into paper napkins, hissing slightly as it cooled. The spoon clattered against the floor with a sound that silenced the immediate vicinity. "Oh, so clumsy," Sterling said, stepping back with a performance of concern that was almost impressive in its cruelty. He shook his head at Elena as if she had disappointed him, as if she had let him down by existing. Around the cafeteria, conversations suspended. 13 people stopped mid-sentence. Eyes moved from their food to Elena's face, looking for a reaction the way crowds once gathered to watch public executions, hoping for a moment of authentic human response to degradation. Elena knelt. The fluorescent lights above her hummed their constant frequency. Her knees met the tile floor with a soft contact. She gathered the letters first, methodically, each piece retrieved and stacked on the overturned bowl. Her movements were economical. No wasted energy. No performance of emotion. Just work. The coffee cup she set upright. The spoon she aligned with the bowl's edge. Around her, the cafeteria staff continued their conversations in subdued tones, everyone maintaining the polite fiction that nothing unusual had happened, which was its own kind of violence. "I'm buying you lunch," said the med student from 3 tables over, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "I'm getting you something fresh." "I saw that." "That wasn't." Elena held up one hand. "I'm fine." Her voice was exactly level. 42 hours without sleep and it was exactly level. She stood, bowl gathered, the mess consolidated. She didn't make eye contact with Sterling. She didn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. The following morning arrived with the kind of Denver autumn clarity that makes everything sharper, more defined. The sun hit the hospital's east-facing windows at 6:19 a.m. and cast the corridors in that particular shade of gold that obscures as much as it reveals. Elena was positioning supplies at the central nursing station when Sterling arrived early, deliberately early, which meant this wasn't spontaneous. This was choreographed. The shift change was happening. The ER at Oak Creek Memorial operated in that specific chaos of handoff, night shift nurses handing off to day shift, residents changing positions, med students rotating through stations. 23 people in motion across a defined space. Maximum audience. Maximum vulnerability. This was his timing. Sterling approached the central desk where Elena stood organizing medication cards. He held a patient chart, not one that belonged to Elena, not one that she needed, just a chart, a prop. He made eye contact with her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he released it, not setting it down, not handing it across, but releasing it downward so the manila folder rotated in the air and the papers scattered across the polished floor like autumn leaves. Dozens of pages, each one requiring retrieval. Each one an humiliation. Each one orchestrated. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched to carry across the ER. "You know where things go." The station went silent. Not gradually. Immediately. The silence was a physical thing, a presence in the room like a pressure system. Elena could feel it on her skin. Residents froze mid-conversation. A nurse stopped walking. A patient in the nearby bed raised his head from his pillow. The custodial staff member paused with his mop bucket half raised. The entire ecosystem held its breath. Dr. Sterling stood with his arms crossed. His right eyebrow raised slightly. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. He was waiting for her to break, and everyone in the room knew it. They were all waiting. This was the moment. This was the test. This was where quiet people were supposed to crack. Elena took one measured breath through her nose. The air tasted like antiseptic and recycled vac and something underneath, fear, maybe, or the particular scent of collective anticipation. She felt something move behind her eyes, a single tear that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with the pressure building in spaces she'd sealed off 3 years ago. The tear escaped. She let it. She wiped it away slowly, methodically, without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Her hand moved from her cheek to her pocket. Her eyes remained on his, absolutely steady, reflecting the overhead fluorescence like still water. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet. Not weak, quiet. The kind of quiet that commands attention through scarcity. I've been called worse by better men. 8 words. 8 words that seemed to resonate at a frequency the fluorescent lights couldn't match. Around the room, eyes widened. The med student's mouth opened slightly. One of the senior nurses exhaled. Sterling's face shifted, the smile faltered, the composure fractured for just a moment before he forced a laugh and turned away, his jaw working, the point made but the point not won because she hadn't broken. She hadn't given him what he needed. Elena knelt. The tile was cold. The paper scattered across it in that specific disorder that chaos creates. She moved through them methodically, retrieving each page, reading the order numbers and procedure codes as she stacked them. Her hands were perfectly steady. This was muscle memory from a different life, staying functional under pressure, the trembling converted to precision, the fear transformed into focus. She found the invoice 3 hours later, tucked into her mailbox beside the staff bathroom. Not addressed to her. Not intended for her. Just sitting there like a message. The paperwork was dense. Order 847, PH for surgical supplies, authorization code dating back 3 weeks, a delivery manifest that claimed receipt when she knew with certainty that no shipment had arrived. The numbers didn't align. The costs were inflated by 40% above standard market rates. Equipment listed as received that she could verify through the supply inventory system was not in the hospital at all. Her fingers trembled once as she held the invoice. Just once. Then the trembling stopped and the clarity returned. She understood what she was looking at. Dr. Sterling had built something elaborate over time, some system of inflation and phantom delivery and billing manipulation. And she, in her quiet way, asking the wrong question about the wrong shipment, had just volunteered to be the obstacle to his continued success. Elena photographed the documents with her phone. 1 image. 2. 3. Each page catalogued, the invoice code and authorization numbers captured in detail. She tucked the papers back into the mailbox. And then she looked up. Dr. Sterling stood in his office window, 12 feet away across the open space of the ER. He was watching her. His expression was unreadable, but his body language had shifted. The casual confidence had transformed into something else, the particular focus of a predator who recognizes that his prey had just revealed itself to be more dangerous than it appeared. Their eyes met across the distance. Neither of them blinked. Neither of them moved. The moment stretched like elastic pull to its limit. Then Sterling turned away from the window and the afternoon light reflected off the glass, obscuring whatever expression had briefly been visible there. 2:47 in the morning. The pneumatic doors hissed open and paramedics rushed through with a stretcher carrying a man, late 20s, muscular build, completely unconscious. His chest wasn't rising properly. The lead paramedic was already calling it tension pneumothorax, vitals bottoming out, oxygen saturation at 58% and dropping like a stone. 1 collapsed lung. Then 2. The air was leaving his chest cavity and nowhere to go. Elena was on pediatrics that shift. She wasn't supposed to be in the trauma bay. But she heard the code announcement and her feet moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory written into her spine from a decade of field medicine, from tents in Helmand province where every second between collapse and treatment meant the difference between breathing and death. She was there before the attending physician even arrived, before the code team assembled. The senior resident, Dr. Kwon, was standing over the stretcher looking at the monitor like it was speaking a language he didn't understand. Paralyzed. The room had that particular silence that comes right before everything goes wrong, the kind of quiet that precedes death in hospitals the same way it precedes incoming fire in combat. Elena could feel it settling into the walls like dust. She moved forward. Not asked. Moved. 14-gauge needle. Her voice came out flat, exact, nothing in it but instruction. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Dr. Kwon turned to her. We need to wait for. He'll arrest in 90 seconds. She was already tearing open the sterile kit, hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this while bullets were coming through canvas. 75, 80 if we're lucky. The thing about trained muscle memory is that it doesn't ask permission. Her left hand found the anatomical landmarks while her right hand positioned the needle. 2 ribs down from the collarbone. The needle went in with a sound like someone puncturing a balloon, the hiss of air escaping the pleural space. Pressurized air that had been crushing his right lung into uselessness suddenly had a way out. The monitor changed. The oxygen saturation climbed. 58. 62. 68. Elena withdrew the needle and held pressure with gauze while her other hand was already reaching for the chest tube setup. Dr. Kwon was calling for backup, but the crisis had already peaked and broken. The man's oxygen was climbing toward normal. His color was changing. His chest was rising again, both sides, the rhythm finding itself like a heartbeat finding home. He's stabilizing. Dr. Kwon sounded like he was waking up. That was, how did you know? Elena didn't answer. She was already cleaning the injection site with antiseptic, the smell of it sharp and chemical, erasing the smell of blood and fear. The sterile gauze came away clean. The wound was closing already, the body doing its automatic work of sealing itself. And that's when she saw it. On his right shoulder, there was a tattoo. Faded. Old ink, the kind that came from a military needle in a base somewhere overseas, not from a civilian artist in a clean studio. The Ranger Regiment patch. The 75th. Elena's breath caught in her throat, the kind of catch that happens when a door opens to a room you locked 20 years ago. She stared at the tattoo. Let her fingers trace the outline of it, following the edges of the regimental insignia. Her mind was already moving backward, already pulling up memories she'd buried under 3 years of double shifts and isolation in Denver, under a decade of nightmares she never talked about, under the single name she'd never spoken aloud to anyone in her current life. Marja. October 2004. Forward operating base now nothing more than rubble and the memory of screams. The scarring beneath the tattoo caught her attention next. She leaned closer, her hands moving with the gentle precision of someone examining a familiar wound. The scar pattern was distinctive, small, precise, surgical stitches. Someone had sutured a shrapnel laceration with meticulous care, someone who'd had to work through pain and limited light and the knowledge that if they fumbled even once, a child would die from infection or blood loss. Elena's hands were trembling. No. Not trembling. Remembering. She'd made those stitches 20 years ago, in a forward surgical team tent with canvas walls and the sound of distant mortars. She'd been a Navy corpsman then, before she had the bars of a senior chief petty officer, before she learned how to bury everything and move forward like a person who'd never been broken by what she'd witnessed. The Rangers had brought in a boy, 7 years old, named Amir. Shrapnel from a Taliban IED had opened his shoulder down to the muscle. The Rangers had risked their own lives to carry him out of the crossfire, and they'd brought him to her because they knew she'd keep him breathing. She remembered singing to him Pashto lullabies she'd learned from villagers who trusted her enough to teach her words in their language. She remembered his small hand gripping her uniform sleeve while she worked, his eyes locked on hers like she was the only real thing in a world that had become nightmare and fire. She'd stitched him with hands that moved like prayer, keeping him calm, keeping him alive, thinking this boy will survive this boy will grow up and maybe he'll remember that someone tried to save his life. And then the Rangers had evacuated him. She'd never known what happened to him. Never let herself wonder, because wondering meant breaking, and breaking wasn't allowed. But the scar pattern below the Ranger Regiment tattoo was unmistakable. Those were her stitches. Those were the precise sutures of someone who'd been trained in field medicine and trained to survive anything. This man, this unconscious Ranger on her stretcher, he was that boy. 2 decades collapsed down to a single moment, to the moment she recognized her own work written on his skin. Dr. Kwon was calling for a level 2 trauma assessment, for imaging, for surgical consult. Elena heard it from very far away. She finished securing the dressing and stepped back from the stretcher, her movement controlled and careful, nothing showing on her face. She'd learned how to hide everything years ago. How to keep the earthquake inside while the surface stayed solid as stone. "I'm assigning Chen to his care," a voice said from the doorway. "Dr. Sterling." He'd arrived while Elena was focused on the patient, his timing impeccable in a way that made something sharp and cold run down the back of her neck. He was looking at Elena with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between satisfaction and frustration, the look of someone watching a game piece move in an unexpected way. "You're back on pediatrics, Martinez. We discussed this." It wasn't a discussion. It was an edict delivered with the weight of institutional power behind it. "Nurse Chen will handle the ER. He's already briefed. Move on." Elena met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Didn't blink. Didn't move. Then she stepped away from the stretcher and walked out of the trauma bay without speaking, without acknowledging him, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing anything crack beneath the surface. The pediatrics ward was fluorescent and humming, the sound of monitors and infant heart rates creating a constant electronic lullaby. Elena clocked back in and pulled up the patient assignments, though her mind was somewhere else entirely. She could see into the ER from certain angles, could watch as Nurse Chen took over the ranger's care, as the code team moved him to a monitored bed, as other people touched the arm with the tattoo on it, people who didn't know what that scar meant, didn't know what story was written in sutures and healed tissue. Her phone buzzed at 6:15 p.m. A text from her 16-year-old son, Marcus, living with her sister in Fort Collins because Elena couldn't quite manage single parenting and the nightmares that kept her awake most nights. "Mom, where are you? You didn't answer about parent-teacher conferences." She stared at the message. Marcus didn't know where she'd come from. He knew she was a nurse. He knew she'd left active duty before he was born, that she worked hospital shifts, that she sometimes woke up screaming and then locked herself in the bathroom until dawn broke. He didn't know about Marja. He didn't know about the faces, about the children she'd held while blood leaked through her fingers, about the moment she decided that carrying that weight any longer would destroy both of them. She'd kept it all locked in a storage unit in North Denver, along with her uniforms, her medals, her discharge papers, the entire life of Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, sealed in a climate-controlled room like a tomb. That evening, Sterling was making calls. Elena heard about it later, from one of the younger nurses who'd overheard him on the phone in his office, voice pitched low and urgent. He was calling board chairman William Fletcher, who apparently owed him favors. He was contacting Elena's professional references with questions about her stability, about gaps in her employment history, about how she'd materialized 3 years ago in Denver without explanation or credential verification beyond what was in her file. He was bringing in an outside investigator from the state medical board to review her case, citing concerns about unauthorized invasive procedures performed without direct physician oversight. The message was clear: if she wanted to stay, she'd have to quit. If she tried to fight, he had the institutional machinery to bury her. Elena sat in her car in the parking garage after her shift, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. The photo on her phone showed her Navy unit, the team she'd served with in Helmand Province. 23 faces. 4 of them were dead. The rest were scattered across the country, living lives that didn't include her, healing from things she wasn't allowed to talk about, forgetting her the way you forget anything that hurts too much to remember. She'd become invisible by choice. A ghost in nursing scrubs, saving lives while keeping hers in suspension, unable to claim any of the things that had made her who she was because claiming them meant becoming someone her son wouldn't recognize. The storage unit was across the city. 12 miles away. Inside it was every piece of evidence that Dr. Sterling was looking for, every proof of a past that would shatter the fiction she'd constructed of a simple hospital nurse named Elena Martinez, someone ordinary enough to push around, someone safe enough to destroy. The phone call started at 6:38 a.m., before Elena's shift even ended. Dr. Sterling sat in his office with the door locked, his fingers moving across his phone with surgical precision, each number dialed a calculated strike. Board member Harrison owed him a favor: 2 years of inflated orthopedic supply contracts, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. Sterling reminded him. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. By 6:52 a.m., 3 other board members had received similar calls. Not requests. Promises. "She's a liability," Sterling said into each phone. "Patient safety. We need to act today." The words were weapons because they were true enough. A nurse performing an invasive procedure without authorization. A procedure that worked, but protocol was protocol, and protocol kept people like Sterling in power. He hung up the last call and pulled up Elena's personnel file on his computer screen. His jaw was tight, his breathing controlled, but something had shifted behind his eyes, the look of a man watching his carefully constructed world develop a hairline fracture. She'd seen the invoice. She'd questioned it. Now she'd performed an unauthorized emergency procedure that had saved a patient's life and made Sterling look like the incompetent he actually was. The solution wasn't subtle anymore. The solution was institutional. At 7:03 a.m., Sterling dialed her references. The first was a supervisor from her previous position at Seattle General, a man named Dr. William Marsh, whom Sterling had met once at a conference. Sterling's voice was smooth, concerned, the tone of a colleague reaching out. "I'm calling about Elena Martinez," he began. "She listed you as a reference. We're considering her for advancement, but we've had some concerns surface. Stability issues. Judgment gaps. I wondered if you'd noticed anything unusual during her time with you." The line was silent. Sterling waited. He knew how to use silence. It made people fill the void with information, with doubt, with assumptions. "Elena was an excellent nurse," Marsh said carefully. "Very competent." "Why?" "There was an incident here," Sterling continued, his voice dropping slightly. "An unauthorized procedure. We're reviewing her credentials more closely now. Any red flags we should know about? Gaps in her background? Inconsistencies?" Another pause. Longer. Sterling heard paper rustling on the other end, Marsh checking Elena's file. "No red flags," Marsh said finally. "She was solid. Quiet. Professional. I'd hire her again without hesitation." Sterling thanked him and ended the call before Marsh could ask questions. The message had been planted. Doubt. Uncertainty. By the time the hospital board started asking about Elena, her references would have been contacted by Sterling's network, not directly, but indirectly, through channels that ensured the right information reached the right people. The system was self-perpetuating. Accusation became rumor, became assumption, became fact. He made 3 more calls. Each one dripping with concern, each one poisoning the well. By 7:45 a.m., before Elena even clocked out of her shift, Sterling had already called the state licensing board and requested an official investigator. He used words like deviation from accepted protocol and concerning pattern of independent decision-making and possible risk to patient safety. The board dispatched an investigator before breakfast. They always did when a doctor called, with the right tone of voice, with the weight of institutional authority behind every syllable. Elena didn't know any of this was happening. She was still in the ER, charting on a 78-year-old with congestive heart failure, her hand steady, her mind already moving to the next patient. The Ranger was stable. Vitals climbing. Oxygenation holding at 96%. She'd saved his life and the life of everyone he might have saved after him, everyone his hands might have healed, everyone his example might have inspired. That was the debt she'd paid, and thought she was finally square with the universe. She was wrong. At 8:22 a.m. sharp, security approached her at the nurse's station. Not hostile. Not yet. Just official. "Elena Martinez," the guard asked, and something in her recognition centers flickered, the tone, the formality, the presence of 2 uniformed officers instead of 1. She knew this rhythm. She'd heard it before, in different uniforms, in different countries, but the underlying message was always the same. "You're wanted for questioning. I need you to come with me," the guard said. "Administrative hearing. Conference room B." Elena set down her pen. She didn't ask why. That would show fear. She simply nodded and stood, her movements controlled, her face blank as fresh snow. Around her, the ER staff watched. The residents pretended not to notice. The attending physicians suddenly became very focused on their charts. Everyone knew what an administrative summons meant. Everyone knew what happened in conference rooms when security escorted you there personally. The conference room was on the 4th floor, sterile and fluorescent lit, with a single long table that divided the space like a border between nations. On one side, Elena, alone. On the other side, Dr. Sterling in a charcoal suit that probably cost $2,000, his expression arranged in careful concern. Beside him sat Rebecca Chen, the hospital administrator, her face professionally neutral. Next to her, a woman in a state licensing board blazer, the investigator, with a leather notebook and the expression of someone who had already made up her mind. And behind them, 2 board members Elena didn't recognize, their power so casual they wore it like cologne. Sterling spoke first. His voice was clinical, measured, the voice of a man presenting data rather than accusations. "Elena, we've called this hearing because of a serious deviation from protocol that occurred yesterday evening during the admission of a trauma patient, Army Ranger John Mackenzie." He didn't look at her. He looked at the investigator, at the board members, making sure they understood he was a man of procedure, of evidence, of institutional responsibility. "You performed a needle decompression for tension pneumothorax without physician authorization. Without a direct order. Without documentation of physician consultation or agreement." Elena's hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her breathing was steady. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The rhythm her drill instructors had taught her 22 years ago. The procedure was performed correctly, Sterling continued. The patient stabilized. But we cannot have nurses independently deciding to perform invasive procedures, regardless of outcome. That way lies chaos. Liability. Patient harm masked by luck. He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were the color of a shark's belly. "The question we need to answer, Elena, is why? Why did you feel authorized to make that decision?" The investigator's pen moved across her notebook. Elena watched the words being written about her in real time, each stroke of the pen another nail in the coffin she'd been building for 3 years, ever since she'd decided that being a nurse in a regular hospital was safer than being anyone the military might remember. "The patient had a tension pneumothorax," Elena said quietly. The room seemed to contract around her voice. The physician responsible was occupied with another critical patient. The code team was 30 seconds out. The patient was losing consciousness. The needle decompression took 40 seconds and restored adequate oxygenation. "And you knew this how?" the investigator asked. Not curious. Suspicious. Building a case. "Clinical assessment," Elena said. One hand steady. One voice calm. The signs were clear. Tracheal deviation. JVD. Unilateral absent breath sounds. Hypertension. "You have significant medical knowledge for a nurse," the board member on the left observed. Not a compliment. A weapon. 11 years of critical care, Elena said. Sterling's mouth tightened. She'd said too much. 11 years would show on her record, and someone would notice the gap between her first nursing credential and her previous work history. Someone would see that she'd disappeared from everywhere else and reappeared in Denver 3 years ago with sealed references and no explanation. The walls were starting to close in with mathematical precision. "We've reviewed your references," Sterling said, and now his voice carried a different quality, satisfaction, like a hunter who'd spotted blood in the water. "Concerns have been raised about your judgment. Your stability. We have a responsibility to patient safety. To institutional integrity." He nodded to Chen, who opened a folder and slid a termination letter across the table like an execution warrant. "Effective immediately," Chen said, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who'd done this 100 times. "Your employment with Oak Creek Memorial is terminated, pending completion of the state investigation. You'll surrender your badge and credentials. Security will escort you from the building. You have the right to legal representation." The room went absolutely still. The kind of silence that happens in hospitals right before someone codes, right before a flat line, right before the universe splits into before and after. Elena reached for the letter. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes didn't waver. She folded the document once, then again, and slid it into her pocket. "When?" she asked. "Now," Sterling said. The escort back downstairs was through the busiest part of morning rounds. Elena had known it would be. Sterling had timed it that way deliberately: maximum visibility, maximum humiliation, maximum erosion of whatever credibility she'd built in 3 years of quiet excellence. The security guard carried a cardboard box containing her locker contents. Inside, a cracked coffee mug with a faded Navy anchor that her first commanding officer had given her in 2001, a dying succulent she'd been trying to nurse back to health for 2 months, and a photograph of her unit from Marja, the faces of 19 people who'd trusted her with their lives, their injuries, their fears. She'd kept the photo face down in her locker, unable to look at it but unable to throw it away. The ER doors opened to the smell of antiseptic and someone spilled coffee and the particular ache of a place where people fought against mortality every single day. Every eye turned toward her. Every conversation stopped. The chart clerk froze mid-keystroke. The residents suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. The attending physicians in the trauma bay pretended they hadn't seen her walk toward the ambulance bay exit with a guard on either side, a cardboard box in her arms, the physical embodiment of professional destruction. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause from an angry god. By the time Elena reached the bus stop across the street, her scrubs were soaked through, rain plastering her Silver Street hair to her face in dark ropes. She set the cardboard box on the bench, water pooling around the bottom edges, the photograph inside already beginning to warp. Behind her, through the rain, Oak Creek Memorial glowed with institutional purpose. Inside those walls, the ranger was asking about the nurse who'd saved him. Inside those walls, Dr. Sterling was sitting at his desk, opening his laptop, pulling up sealed military records with access credentials that should never have been available to him, his screen filling with information that would drain color from his face as he finally understood what he'd actually done. Inside those walls, the system was moving forward without her, indifferent to her absence, the way systems always were. Elena sat on the bus stop bench in the rain, alone, waiting for a bus that would take her to an apartment she could no longer afford, to a son who didn't know why his mother sometimes woke up screaming, to a life that had finally caught up with the one she'd been running from. That was when Marcus appeared, running through the downpour, gasping, soaked to the bone, clutching a cardboard box of his own. "Mom," he called out, skidding to a stop at the bench, his teenage voice breaking with something between anger and revelation. "They need to see these." Security walked her out at 7:16 a.m., their hands barely touching her elbow, but the gesture was final. Elena's cardboard box, the kind that holds takeout or old textbooks, held everything she'd earned in 3 years, a cracked mug from a gift exchange, a dying succulent someone had left on the break room counter, and a photograph of her Navy unit from 20 years ago. The faces in that photo stared up at her, frozen in time, before her old life and this one had become enemies. Rain hammered the glass doors of Oak Creek Memorial as she stepped outside. Her scrubs were already soaked. Nobody had offered her an umbrella. She made it 2 blocks to the bus stop, standing under a shelter that did almost nothing, when Marcus ran up. Not walked. Ran. Her 16-year-old son, soaked to his skin, his hair plastered against his forehead, holding a cardboard storage box like it contained something that mattered more than anything in the world. His lungs heaved. His eyes were red. "Mom." One word. But it carried everything. Elena turned to face him, and for the first time that morning, something in her chest tightened. Not broke. Never broke. But tightened. "I broke into the unit," Marcus gasped, rain sliding down his face. Like, I called Mr. Reeves and told him it was an emergency and he let me in because he knows you and Marcus stopped, breathing hard. You never told me. You never told me any of it. The box trembled in his hands. Not from cold. From urgency. Elena didn't speak. She waited. This was the technique she'd learned in Marja, let the other person fill the silence. Pull them out, Marcus said, thrusting the box toward her. They need to see these. Now. Before they. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Behind them, across the parking lot where Oak Creek Memorial's ER entrance glowed against the morning rain, Dr. Sterling stood under the awning with the hospital board. Rebecca Chen, the administrator. Board Chairman Fletcher, his face already showing the first cracks of understanding. And Sterling was watching her, his expression the color of spoiled milk. Marcus opened the box with shaking hands. The medals came first. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Medical discharge papers. Naval Service record. Performance evaluations that read like they'd been written about a different person, a person Elena had spent 3 years hiding from. Marcus's voice cracked as he read from the official Navy documentation, rain-spotted but unmistakable, Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. The room, no, the parking lot, went so quiet you could hear the rain hammer the hospital roof like distant gunfire. The administrator, Rebecca Chen, moved first. She crossed the wet asphalt toward Elena and Marcus with the careful steps of someone approaching an animal she'd misjudged. Her hands trembled as she took the file from Marcus, the paper waterlogged and precious, and she read aloud, not to Elena, but to everyone else standing under that awning. Bronze Star for leadership under fire. Silver Star for, her voice caught, sustained medical operations under active combat conditions, Helm and Province, 2004. 2 Purple Hearts. And then, her hands literally shaking as she held the final document, Navy Cross. Valor in combat. Citation reads, for extraordinary heroism in connection with combat operations against an armed enemy in Marja, Helm and Province, Afghanistan. That was when the wheelchair appeared. Sergeant First Class Daniel Ashford rolled out of the ER entrance, his uniform pressed, his movements still careful but unmistakably present. Alive. The SEAL liaison, a man with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen things that made other people's certainties seem stupid, pushed the wheelchair. And as he approached the group standing in the rain, he began to speak in a voice like grinding gears, precise and authoritative. Marja. Helmand Province. January 2004. This woman held a field hospital alone for 14 hours under fire. The SEAL liaison's eyes moved from Sterling to the board to Marcus, making sure every single person understood what he was saying. 14 hours. 1 medic. 63 patients treated. 0 fatalities. He gestured to Daniel, whose hand reached out and touched Elena's arm, not a grab, but an acknowledgement. This child was 7 years old when she stitched his wound. Sang to him in Pashto while shrapnel fell outside the tent. He kept that memory through 12 years of foster care. 12 years. Sterling's face had gone the color of old paper. The SEAL liaison continued, his voice cutting through the rain like a blade. She performed an unauthorized emergency decompression on Sergeant Ashford 3 days ago. Unauthorized. That procedure saved his life. That's twice he owes his life to her. The liaison paused, letting silence accumulate like water gathering behind a dam. When you fire someone for using combat medicine to save a life, you expose yourselves to federal liability. When you forge personnel records to justify that termination, he gestured slightly toward the parking lot entrance, where 3 people in dark suits had just emerged from an unmarked sedan. Federal Bureau of Investigation badges visible from 50 feet away. You expose yourselves to prosecution. The FBI agents moved with the unhurried precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times. They approached Dr. Sterling, and the lead agent, a woman whose expression suggested she'd seen worse than Sterling could imagine, said something Elena didn't quite catch. but she saw Sterling's hands drop to his sides. She saw his mouth open and close like he was trying to speak words that no longer existed. She saw the moment his power, which had felt so complete 20 minutes ago, simply evaporated. They walked him out in handcuffs. Not roughly. Just professionally. Past the nurses who'd watched him humiliate Elena. Past the orderlies who'd heard him laugh in the cafeteria. Past the residents who'd learned how to be cruel by watching a master. His expensive watch caught the rain and fractured it into tiny rainbows that nobody was watching. The administrator, Rebecca Chen, turned to face Elena with eyes that had changed in the last 5 minutes. The calculation was gone. In its place was something Elena recognized from her Navy years, respect earned too late, but earned. "I'm sorry," Chen said. 8 years of hospital politics in those 3 words. "I'm so sorry." Elena didn't respond. She was looking at Marcus, whose shoulders had straightened, who was watching her with an expression that suggested his entire understanding of his mother had just been rewritten. In a better direction. In the true direction. The next words Elena spoke carried the weight of a woman who'd spent 3 years learning how to be small. "I'd like my position back." Not a request. A statement. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'll do better than that," Chen said, and her voice had steadied now, the voice of an administrator who'd just realized she'd made a catastrophic error and was going to spend the next decade trying to correct it. "We're creating a new title. Director of Emergency Services. Full authority over ER operations. Starting immediately." 2 months later, Elena stood at a podium in Oak Creek Memorial's main conference room wearing a Navy suit that fit her like armor. The staff of the hospital, many of whom had watched Dr. Sterling treat her like furniture, rose to their feet. The applause was genuine. It was also guilty, but she could work with that. Rebecca Chen handed her a framed certificate and a set of keys. Her speech was brief because Elena had learned long ago that power speaks quietly. "I thought hiding from my past would bring peace," she said, her voice steady as a surgical light. It brought only silence. Real peace comes from standing in your truth, even when your truth includes scars. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the newly renovated trauma bay included Daniel Ashford in his dress uniform. His recovery had been remarkable, the kind of recovery that happens when a patient has something to recover for. When the procedure was finished, when the photographs had been taken, he approached Elena with a shadow box. Inside was a faded unit patch. Her unit patch. The one she'd worn 23 years ago before the nightmares came. Somehow, or through evacuation, foster care, military service, deployment, he'd kept it sewn inside his jacket lining. "You gave me life twice," Daniel said quietly. "Once in Marja. Once in this ER. This belongs with you." Elena hung it in her new office, positioned next to the photograph of her Navy unit that she'd finally stopped running from. The photo from her cardboard box, now framed and permanent, showed faces she'd loved and lost and carried in silence. Now they weren't silent anymore. Now they bore witness to everything she'd become. Across Denver, in a fluorescent-lit classroom at community college, Dr. Sterling taught CPR to bored teenagers, pushing down on a CPR dummy's chest, demonstrating compressions that mattered to no one. His medical license was suspended pending trial. His wife had filed for divorce. His private practice had evaporated. His expensive watch had been sold to pay legal fees. He'd become what he'd always feared, ordinary. Invisible. A man teaching chest compressions to people who barely looked at his face. Elena would never know these details. She didn't need to. What she knew was that her hands no longer trembled when ambulance sirens sounded. What she knew was that Marcus had stopped asking why she hadn't told him. What she knew was that standing in the truth, even the painful truth, was infinitely better than standing in silence. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You need only the courage to show up, to do what's right when it's hard, and to never let cruelty make you cruel. If you've ever felt buried by circumstance, if you've ever hidden strength because the world taught you that strength was dangerous, then Elena's story is yours too. What would you have done in her position? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken? Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes, and comment below, have you ever had your own moment when the truth finally had to come out? Like this video and share it with someone who needs to know that their silence doesn't have to be permanent. We'll see you next time.